It was a damp London morning in 1848. The fog clung so heavily to the cobblestones that even the street lamps seemed to be choking. The market square was alive with the usual clamor. Hawkers called out the prices of cabbages and coal. Sheep bleated from pens in tight corners. Cartwheels creaked as barrels of gin rolled past. Yet amid the familiar bustle there was something else, something that hung thicker than the fog. A hush passed over pockets of the crowd whenever the subject was mentioned. It was spoken in half snarls and half whispers. They are selling her today. Not a horse, not a pig, not a crate of linen. A woman. The bride auctions had no official stage and no banners. They happened in the open, and yet they felt hidden. The men who ran them wanted no authorities sniffing too closely, and still they thrived on the spectacle. They gathered in markets because markets already meant commerce. What was one more transaction so long as the coins clinked and the crowd cheered? At the edge of the square, a young girl named Mary Ann stood with her shawl pulled tightly across her shoulders. She was 19, but her face carried the weariness of someone twice her age. Her husband, a laborer with debts piled higher than his wages, had dragged her there at first light. She clutched the hem of her dress as though holding it could anchor her in place. But even she knew that once the shouting began, nothing, neither fabric nor flesh, would shield her. The auctioneer was not a professional. He was a butcher by trade. His voice cracked and rough from years of shouting at livestock. He stood on a barrel, raising his hand, calling for attention. The crowd tightened in, forming a living cage around Mary Ann. She felt their breath on her neck, the stink of beer and damp wool coats pressing closer. "Gentlemen," the butcher roared, his tone mocking formality. "We have before us a fine young specimen, fit, obedient, and bred from good stock. Who will start the bidding?" The laughter that followed was not kind. It was jagged and braying, more suited to an animal pit than to a human life. Mary Ann's eyes darted toward a constable in the corner. He leaned against a lamppost, his helmet tilted low, pretending to study his boots. He would not interfere. They rarely did. These were considered private matters, family disputes dressed up as transactions. The first bid came from a coal merchant, his face blackened with soot. He raised a hand more for the crowd's recognition than for the girl's. "A crown," he barked. The butcher slammed his fist against the barrel as though sealing the promise. Another hand rose. A farmer already drunk, though the sun had barely risen. He waved a tankard, spilling froth onto his boots. "2 crowns. She will make a fine maid in my house." The bids came quicker then. 3 crowns. 5. The numbers themselves meant nothing to Mary Ann. They were just sounds, like the cawing of crows overhead. What mattered was the way the men looked at her, not as a person, but as property. Her body became inventory. Her silence became compliance. She thought of her mother's words. A woman's worth is in her husband's hands. But standing here, her wrists trembling, she wondered if a woman had any worth at all. The butcher barked again. 10 crowns. Do I hear 10? His voice cracked with triumph. Somewhere in the back, a boy no older than 12 laughed, his gap-toothed grin shining through the fog. Even children learned early what women were worth. As the bidding climbed, the fog thickened, curling around the scene like a curtain. But Mary Ann could see clearly enough. The men's greed, the women's silence, the cold indifference of the law. And she understood something that would haunt her forever. This was not an accident. This as not a mistake. This was a system. An ugly ritual carved into the marrow of Victorian life. The gavel did not fall. There was no gavel here. Only the butcher's hand slamming against wood. A sound that cracked like bone. "Sold!" he cried, his grin wide, his teeth yellow. The crowd erupted, half jeers and half cheers, as Mary Ann's husband pocketed the coins with a trembling hand. Mary Ann did not scream. She did not fight. She simply lowered her eyes, as though by looking at the mud, she could sink into it and disappear. But the whispers in the crowd carried on, spreading like smoke. Who is next? Which husband will sell his wife tomorrow? Which man will put a price on love? And as the fog rolled over the market, swallowing the square in its ghostly shroud, it was clear that Marianne's story was not the first and would not be the last. 2 days had passed since Marianne was sold, and already the market had washed the memory away with fresh noise and new transactions. To the crowd, she was just another face, another bargain struck in the fog of Victorian London. Yet in the back rooms of alehouses and the corners of tenement halls, the whispers lingered. They always lingered. For every woman sold in the square, there were 10 more spoken of in hushed tones. Men traded stories of it as though swapping cards. A blacksmith in Whitechapel had sold his wife for a jug of ale. A chimney sweep in Manchester had bartered his for 3 shillings and a set of boots. The amounts hardly mattered. What mattered was the ritual, the spectacle of ownership. The law looked away. The church muttered half-hearted condemnations, but never pressed. They said these were not marriages undone, but private agreements between husband and wife. A contract honored in coin. And so the practice grew roots, deeper each year, until it became tradition. A cruel, unspoken tradition that everyone pretended not to see. In one narrow lane on the east side of London, a woman named Eliza lived, in constant fear of becoming the next name whispered in the square. She was 32, her skin weathered from years of scrubbing laundry in cold water, her hands cracked and red. Her husband, Thomas, was a dock worker with a temper as short as his wages. Each time he came home with empty pockets, the glint in his eyes reminded her of the markets. She knew what that look meant. Eliza's neighbors avoided speaking of it, but they saw the signs. The arguments that rattled through the thin walls. The bruises she tried to hide beneath long sleeves. The way Thomas lingered by the tavern, muttering to his friends about debts he could not pay. One night, Eliza overheard him. His voice slurred with drink, his laughter hard and mean. 5 crowns. That is what she would fetch. Maybe more if the butcher stirs the crowd. Her heart seized. She sat frozen in the dark, the words digging claws into her chest. She had no illusions of escape. Women rarely escaped. Even those who tried found themselves dragged back by lawmen who claimed to be upholding the sanctity of marriage. In truth, they were upholding the sanctity of men. The following morning, Eliza carried her washing to the river and prayed. Not to God exactly, for she had lost faith in divine ears long ago, but to something larger than herself. To the stones, to the fog, to the city itself. Anything that might keep her safe another day. But in London, prayers were often drowned by coin. By the week's end, Thomas appeared at her side with a look that confirmed her fears. He did not need to say it. The crowd already knew. The butcher had already been told. Another sale was coming. And so, word spread again. Another woman. Another price. Another silence from the men of law who could stop it, but chose not to. In the taverns, the whispers grew. How many wives this month? More than sheep, I swear it. God help them, or maybe he won't. The market square prepared itself once more. The barrel stood ready. The crowd thickened. And Eliza, clutching her shawl like a shield, stepped into the fog with the weight of history pressing down upon her. Because the bride auctions of Victorian England were never just about one woman. They were about all women. They were about silence. The silence of neighbors, the silence of priests, the silence of husbands who chose coin over love. And silence has a price paid not in crowns or shillings, but in dignity. The morning of Eliza's sale broke with a heavy fog clinging to the Thames. The city seemed to exhale a damp gray breath that seeped into every brick and cobblestone. The market square was alive long before sunrise. its air thick with the mingled smells of coal smoke, sweat, and roasted chestnuts. Merchants shouted their wares: apples, eels, bread gone stale by dawn. But woven among these everyday cries was a sharper, crueler note, a whisper that stiffened the air. Another wife for sale. The barrel was dragged into place by two boys no older than 12, their laughter echoing off stone walls as though they were preparing a game, not a public humiliation. The butcher himself arrived soon after, his apron stained not with blood this time, but with the arrogance of a man who had presided over many such transactions. He thumped the barrel with his palm, nodding to the crowd as if it were an altar. By mid-morning, the square was dense with bodies. Dock workers, apprentices, merchants, and even ladies in feathered hats who pretended to sneer but lingered all the same. These sales were not merely business, they were theater. Each one promised scandal, shame, and the thrill of power disguised as tradition. Eliza stood behind Thomas, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She felt the eyes before she saw them, hundreds of them pressing against her skin, and she heard the low chuckles, the murmurs of men already estimating her value as if she were cattle at Smithfield. Her hands shook so violently she hid them in the folds of her dress. Thomas, red-faced from drink, held her arm like a leash. He grinned at the butcher, slapped the barrel, and raised his voice above the din. "Here she is, strong as any mare, and twice as obedient." The crowd erupted into cruel laughter. Eliza lowered her gaze, wishing herself invisible. The butcher cleared his throat, his voice booming like a town crier. "We begin the bidding. Who will start us off at 2 crowns? A hand shot up, a tanner with leather-stained fingers, grinning with teeth blackened by tobacco. 2 crowns, he shouted. Another voice, sharper, eager. 3. The numbers rose quickly, each shout accompanied by the jostling of elbows and the exchange of sly glances. Men were not merely buying a wife, they were buying a spectacle, proving their dominance in the theater of ownership. Eliza's pulse hammered in her ears. Each new bid felt like a nail sealing her coffin. She tried to breathe, but the square pressed tighter, the sound swelling around her like the tide. And then, from the back of the crowd, a voice cut through. 5 crowns. Silence fell. Heads turned. It was not the butcher, nor a laborer, nor a dockhand. It was a man in a dark coat, his face hidden beneath the brim of a hat. His tone was calm, deliberate, without the drunken eagerness of the others. The butcher's eyes widened. 5 crowns was a sum far higher than most men would waste on a wife. He turned toward Thomas. "Well, shall we take it?" Thomas nodded greedily, already envisioning the coins in his hand. But the stranger did not smile. He did not approach the barrel. Instead, he fixed his gaze on Eliza. For the first time that morning, she felt seen not as property, but as a person. The look was fleeting, but it ignited something fragile inside her, a spark of defiance. The butcher slammed his hand against the barrel. "Sold," he declared. The crowd roared in approval, their laughter spilling into the alleys like smoke. Another wife gone. Another transaction complete. Yet as the stranger stepped forward to claim his purchase, Eliza's story took a turn no one in the square could have predicted. For in that moment, the bride auctions of Victorian England shifted from cruelty to something darker, something far more dangerous. The man in the dark coat stepped forward with a measured calm that unsettled the rowdy crowd. He was not drunk, nor did he swagger with the arrogance of conquest. He carried himself with an almost unsettling composure, as though the chaos of the auction had been staged for his arrival. His boots struck the cobblestones in steady rhythm, each step cutting through the murmurs of those gathered. The brim of his hat cast a shadow across his face, obscuring his eyes, yet Eliza could feel them fixed upon her. For a fleeting moment, she wondered whether this stranger had come as rescuer or executioner. The butcher licked his lips, clapping his hands together. "Well done, sir. A fine purchase indeed. Step forward and take her. But the man did not obey. Instead, he slipped a leather pouch from inside his coat and placed it gently on the barrel. The coins within clinked with a weight that silenced the few who dared mutter. The butcher loosened the strings and inhaled sharply at the sight of silver glinting within. 5 crowns exactly. Paid in full. The stranger's voice was low, calm, and deliberate. She goes with me, and none of you will follow. The butcher frowned, but greed dulled his courage. Thomas, however, was too drunk on victory and coin to sense the tension. He slapped the man's back, laughing coarsely. You'll have your hands full with this one, sir. She bites. The stranger did not laugh. His gloved hand closed over Eliza's wrist, firm but not cruel, guiding her away from the barrel. She stumbled at first, her legs weak from standing, but the grasp steadied her. The crowd parted reluctantly, disappointed that the entertainment had ended too soon. As they walked through the square, the jeers followed. Mind you don't return her. Hope she's worth the silver, mister. Yet beneath the mockery there was something else. Curiosity. Who was this man willing to pay such a price? And why had he vanished into the fog without a word of triumph? Eliza's breath came fast, her heart thundering in her chest. She could not summon the courage to speak until they had turned down a narrow alley, the din of the square fading behind them. She finally whispered, her voice cracking. Why did you buy me? The stranger paused. For the first time she saw his face clearly. His features were sharp, his expression unreadable, his eyes the color of storm clouds. To keep you from them, he said simply. Eliza blinked, stunned by the words. No man had ever spoken to her without laced cruelty, without ownership curling in his tone. Yet before she could ask more, he turned and continued walking, as though the matter were settled. They wound their way through twisting streets, past soot-streaked buildings and shops shuttered against the mist. The stranger's silence pressed heavier with each step, his presence both unsettling and strangely protective. At last, they reached a carriage waiting at the edge of the city. The horses stamped and snorted, their breath forming pale ghosts in the morning air. The driver tipped his cap without a word, as though he too had been expecting this moment. The stranger opened the door and gestured for Eliza to enter. She hesitated, her instincts torn between gratitude and terror. This man had saved her from public humiliation, but had she simply exchanged one prison for another? The stranger seemed to sense her fear. You can step inside and trust me, he said quietly, or remain here, where the crowd will soon return for its sport. The choice is yours. It was the first choice Eliza had been given in years. With trembling hands, she gathered her skirts and climbed into the carriage. The door shut with a heavy finality, and the wheels creaked into motion. As the fog swallowed the city behind them, Eliza felt the weight of uncertainty pressing closer. Who was this man? Why had he bought her? And where, in God's name, was he taking her? The auction was over, but the true bargain had only just begun. The interior of the carriage smelled faintly of leather and damp wood, the cushions worn yet clean, as though the vehicle had seen countless journeys through mist and mud. Eliza pressed herself against the seat, clutching the edge as though the very act of gripping the fabric would anchor her in this storm of uncertainty. The stranger sat opposite, his coat drawn tightly around him, his hat resting on the seat beside him now. Without its shadow, his face was more clearly revealed. Not the gaunt cruelty of Thomas, nor the bloated arrogance of the butcher, but a man who carried quiet scars. Lines marked his forehead, not from laughter, but from years of silence and thought. The horses clattered over the cobblestones, their hooves striking in rhythm with the pounding of Eliza's heart. She dared to speak, her voice little more than a whisper. You said you saved me. But from what? From them? Or from something worse? The stranger's gaze did not waver. He spoke slowly, as though weighing every syllable. I saved you from being paraded like an animal, from being bound to a man who would destroy you. That is enough for now. His words, though calm, struck deeper than Eliza expected. She looked out the window, watching the lanterns of the marketplace fade into the mist. The laughter of the crowd echoed in her ears still, though muffled now, like a dream slipping into memory. At length, she asked, "What is your name?" The stranger hesitated. Then, in a voice almost reluctant, he replied, "Jonathan Hale." The name sounded familiar, though Eliza could not place where she had heard it. Perhaps whispered in the market, perhaps scribbled in old town records she had once glimpsed before life became only survival. "And where are you taking me, Mr. Hale?" Jonathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed upon hers with unnerving intensity. "To safety. To a place where men cannot buy you, and where their coins have no power." Eliza laughed bitterly, unable to stop herself. "No such place exists. Not in England. Not in this world." Jonathan did not flinch at her cynicism. Instead, he nodded as though she had spoken truth he already understood. "Perhaps not. But there are places where men fear discovery, where silence is more profitable than cruelty. That is where we go." His cryptic words stirred more questions than answers. She wanted to demand clarity, to know whether he was a savior or simply another man weaving a prettier cage. Yet something in his tone, firm, steady, unwavering, made her hold her tongue. The carriage jolted as it turned sharply off the main road, wheels grinding against gravel. Eliza peered through the fog-streaked window and saw they were leaving the town behind. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying the damp scent of fields and distant riverbanks. Jonathan drew from his coat a small satchel, setting it on his lap. He untied the leather straps and revealed a collection of items: papers, folded maps, and a curious notebook filled with precise handwriting. He leafed through the pages, occasionally glancing at her, as though deciding how much to reveal. Eliza, torn between fear and curiosity, asked, "What is it you want from me?" Jonathan closed the notebook slowly, his hand resting upon it. His answer came not as command, but as confession. "I want nothing from you, but I need you to understand something. You were not the first, nor will you be the last." Her stomach turned cold. "What do you mean?" Jonathan leaned back, his face half illuminated by the swaying lantern inside the carriage. "These auctions are not mere spectacles of drunken men and desperate wives. They are part of something older, something rooted in tradition and cruelty that the law turns its eyes from. I have seen it in village after village. Women sold, lives destroyed, families broken as though they were cattle at market. It is not chance that brought me to that square tonight. I follow them. I record them. I expose them." Eliza's breath caught in her throat. You are no buyer then." Jonathan's gaze hardened. "I am a witness. And you, Eliza, you are proof. Proof that these markets thrive in shadow, while the world pretends civility. Proof that voices silenced can still be heard if someone dares to listen." The carriage rocked as it hit a rut, but neither of them flinched. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with something both terrifying and hopeful. Eliza pressed her palms together, whispering words she had not spoken in years. "Then why me? Why save me when so many others—" Jonathan's voice softened, almost breaking through his composure. "Because you looked back at them. Even when they jeered, even when they pulled at you, you did not bow your head. That defiance is rare. It deserves a chance to survive." For the first time, Eliza felt tears sting her eyes, not of despair, but of something sharper, something resembling hope. The carriage pressed onward into the fog, leaving behind the city and its jeering crowd. Yet the farther they traveled, the clearer it became. This journey was not an escape, but an entry into a deeper web of secrets. For Eliza, the auction block was no longer the end. It was the beginning of something she could not yet name. While the public image of bride auctions was already grim, what often went unseen were the layers of exploitation behind the curtain. These auctions were not just marketplaces for women. They became ecosystems where e-profiteers thrived. At the very top of this system were the auctioneers themselves. These men, often smooth-tongued and commanding, turned women into spectacles. They studied every detail of a woman's body, demeanor, and background to craft a narrative that would drive up her value. The tone of their voices, the jokes they cracked at women's expense, and even the way they forced them to parade before a crowd all served one purpose: to maximize profit. Yet, beneath the auctioneer stood an entire network of opportunists. Brothel owners often attended these events, disguising their intentions. Instead of offering these women a home or companionship, they pulled them into lives of servitude, branding them as wives in name, but exploiting them in reality. Families, driven by poverty, sometimes sold daughters directly to these bidders, a heartbreaking cycle of desperation feeding corruption. The women themselves bore the heaviest burden. Many had no choice in the matter. Some were orphans passed through the hands of institutions that saw them less as children to protect and more as assets to liquidate. Others were working-class women who had been abandoned or widowed with no legal system to protect them from destitution. The auction stripped them not only of agency, but of identity, reducing them to a transaction. And then there were the spectators. For many, these events were twisted entertainment. Crowds would gather not only to bid, but to laugh, jeer, and whisper about the lots on display. Every stare, every comment reinforced the cruel reality that these women were not viewed as human beings, but as commodities to be owned. Even more chilling was the way laws and institutions turned a blind eye. While official courts might not have sanctioned these auctions directly, there were few mechanisms to stop them. Police officers, local officials, and community leaders often ignored what was happening, seeing it as a private matter. The silence of the law was as damning as the cruelty of the practice itself. Behind the curtain of spectacle was a theater of suffering. It was not simply a practice of buying and selling brides. It was a mirror reflecting how a society, caught between tradition and change, allowed its most vulnerable to be traded away, while those with wealth and power looked on, or profited. Behind every bride auction lay a human life, a young woman whose story was rarely told. The records that survive, fragmented and faded, still give us glimpses into the fates of those who stood on the block. These stories are haunting because they remind us that what seemed like a marketplace was, in fact, a graveyard of futures. One such tale speaks of a girl named Clara, only 17. She was brought to an auction by her uncle after her parents died of illness. Dressed in plain cloth, she trembled under the eyes of bidders who saw her not as a grieving child, but as an object of labor and obedience. Clara was purchased by a wealthy landowner twice her age. Within weeks, she was reported to have vanished from the town's records. Her story faded into silence, leaving only speculation of whether she fled, was hidden away, or met a darker end. Then there was Margaret, a widow with no money after her husband's death in a factory accident. Desperate to survive, she consented to an auction, hoping she might secure a home. She was sold to a man who promised security, but treated her as little more than free labor. Margaret's letters, found decades later, described her days as a prison with no bars, but no escape. Her tale became a quiet testament to the many women who were trapped under the guise of marriage. Equally unsettling are the stories of children. Some accounts tell of orphans as young as 12, paraded before crowds of men. While their small size and fragile demeanor should have invoked pity, bidders instead calculated what years of service or childbearing potential these girls might hold. The cruelty of reducing childhood to a transaction is a stain that lingers on history. Yet, not all stories end in despair. There are accounts, rare but remarkable, of women who resisted. Some deliberately sabotaged their auctions, spitting at bidders, shouting insults, or collapsing on the stage. These acts of defiance often came at a heavy price, but they stand as proof that even in a system designed to strip them of power, women found ways to declare, "I am not for sale." These individual stories pierce the statistics and the faded ink of old records. They remind us that bride auctions were not abstract events, but moments where real people, with dreams and fears, were thrust into a cruel stage they never asked to enter. And their echoes still ask us, how could a society that prided itself on morality and progress allow such tragedies to unfold? The bride auctions of Victorian England did not exist in isolation. They were woven into a larger machinery of exploitation that stretched across homes, factories, and fields. To understand them fully, we must see how they mirrored and reinforced the broader system that kept women and the poor in cycles of dependence. Industrialization had changed the face of England. Men, women, and children worked long hours in factories, mines, and textile mills, often for meager wages. Yet women faced a double burden. Even when they worked outside the home, society insisted that their true role was to be wives and mothers. This meant that economic survival for many women was tethered to finding a husband. And when traditional marriage failed, desperate measures like auctions filled the void. The exploitation was systematic. Landlords, factory owners, and even clergy often played roles in directing women toward auctions or forced matches. To them, it was not cruelty, but efficiency, a way to solve the problem of poverty while maintaining social order. The language of morality cloaked acts of control. By calling women fallen if they resisted, or saved if they complied, society turned oppression into virtue. Even the legal system acted as a net. Once married, a woman's property became her husband's. Her wages, if she earned them, belonged to him. In court, her testimony carried little weight. In effect, women were legally erased, their identities absorbed into their husband's name and will. Bride auctions were not merely spectacles of humiliation. They were logical outcomes of laws that already defined women as possessions. The machinery also ran on silence. Newspapers that reported auctions often wrote with a tone of curiosity or humor, framing the events as oddities rather than injustices. Cartoons mocked the women, portraying them as greedy, foolish, or desperate. The men were shown as practical buyers. This ridicule served a purpose. It discouraged sympathy, making the public less likely to see the auctions as cruelty and more as entertainment. And then there was religion. Many church leaders preached submission as a divine duty. Passages were twisted to argue that a woman's worth lay in obedience, and that even humiliating arrangements could be God's will. Some clergymen, shockingly, even officiated after these auctions, turning transactions into sanctified unions. What should have been a shield of morality became another arm of exploitation. In this vast web, women's choices were squeezed thinner and thinner. Work, marriage, or starvation, that was the reality for many. Bride auctions may have been the most visible symptom, but the disease ran deeper. A society built on inequality, upheld by law, custom, and faith. When we peel back the curtain on this machinery, the question becomes chilling. How many Claras, Margarets, and unnamed children were caught in its gears, their lives consumed without record? If the machinery of exploitation was the skeleton of bride auctions, then public spectacle was its flesh, the thing that gave it form, visibility, and power. These auctions thrived not in the shadows, but in the open streets, markets, and taverns of Victorian England. They relied on the gaze of the crowd. Imagine it, a wooden platform erected hastily in the square, or a makeshift stage outside a public house. A woman, often trembling, her dress worn but cleaned for the occasion, would be brought forward. A rope, sometimes looped loosely around her arm or waist, was meant to symbolize the transfer of property. Laughter and jeers rose from the crowd, men jostling each other, children perched on shoulders to see better. What strikes us today as grotesque was, in that time, entertainment. Just as people attended public hangings or cockfights, they came to auctions of human futures. Ale was sold, jokes were made, and gossip thrived. Each bid carried not only the weight of money, but also the delight of performance. Men shouted out numbers, then bartered, then mocked each other. It was a theater of cruelty, where the script demanded humiliation. For the women, the gaze was crushing. To stand on that stage was to be stripped of personhood, transformed into something between a commodity and a curiosity. Even if the auction ended with her moving into a home where she would not be beaten or starved, the memory of that spectacle would remain like a scar, a moment when her life became the sport of others. But the public spectacle served another purpose: control through fear. Women who merely heard about these events, who never once stood on those platforms, absorbed their lesson. They learned that society could humiliate and dispose of them at will. This created an invisible boundary of obedience. Better to endure a cruel husband quietly than to risk the public shame of being sold. The crowd's laughter also dulled the sting of conscience for the men who organized and participated. When an act of cruelty is shared and normalized in public, it begins to feel less like cruelty and more like tradition. A woman wept as bids were shouted, yet the audience saw not her despair, but a performance. Their gaze turned suffering into a show. Some accounts mention rare moments of defiance. Women who shouted insults back at bidders. Women who refused to walk with the man who won them. Women who tore at their own clothes in rage, forcing the crowd to recoil in discomfort. These outbursts, though powerful, were often swiftly suppressed. By mockery, by force, or by priests insisting that rebellion was sin. The spectacle turned individuals into symbols. Each woman on that platform represented not herself alone, but every woman watching. A living warning of what might happen if you strayed too far from society's expectations. And so, the stage became more than wood and rope. It became a theater of power. And the audience its silent accomplices. Behind every bride auction, behind every cruel performance staged for the crowd, lay a machinery of power. Vast, invisible, and relentless. This machinery was not made of gears or iron, but of laws, customs, and silence. It functioned not because it was just, but because it was accepted. At the heart of it was property. In Victorian England, a woman did not own her own wages, her own body, or even, in many cases, her own children. A husband had legal rights that extended over nearly every aspect of her existence. When a marriage failed or abuse became unbearable, women had few avenues of escape. Divorce was nearly impossible for the poor. Shelters were scarce. And so, the auction became a grotesque alternative. An unofficial mechanism society tolerated because it relieved men of unwanted burdens and reinforced their authority. Religion, too, played its part in this machinery. Priests preached about obedience, submission, and the sacredness of vows. A woman's duty was to endure, they said, no matter the cruelty of her husband. Those who participated in auctions often justified them by twisting scripture into a tool of control. Better to be sold, some claimed, than to defy God by leaving a husband. Thus, faith, something meant to comfort, became another chain. The law's silence was another cog in this system. Police officers who saw auctions often turned a blind eye. Magistrates heard rumors, but rarely interfered. Why? Because many believed it was a family matter. So long as no riot broke out, so long as money exchanged hands peacefully, the machinery of law stayed idle. This passivity gave tacit permission for the trade to continue. The crowd, as we have seen, acted as fuel. Their laughter, their cheers, their willingness to gather, transformed cruelty into public entertainment. But perhaps the most insidious part of the machinery was not the crowd's no, ice, but its silence afterward. Neighbors who went home said nothing. Families who disapproved whispered privately, but never confronted the system. Silence, multiplied 1,000 times, became complicity. The auctioneer was merely the operator, the visible face of the machinery. He shouted bids, cracked jokes, and stirred up the crowd. But his power came from those larger forces behind him. He was not the creator of this cruelty, only its executor. Yet his role was critical. With each sale, he oiled the gears, kept the system running, made it seem natural. For the women, this machinery was a trap with no visible exit. Even when sold, even when passed from one man to another, they remained caught in its spinning wheels. Escape required not only courage, but an almost impossible stroke of luck. A sympathetic family, a distant relative, or a rare moment of public outrage that could tip the balance. The machinery of power worked because it was hidden in plain sight. It needed no chains when obedience was taught from birth, no prisons when society itself enforced compliance. And in this sense, bride auctions were not just events. They were the visible expression of an invisible system, a system designed to remind women that they were property, and men that they were masters. Not every woman accepted the fate the machinery forced upon her. In the shadows of England's marketplaces, in the whispered corners of taverns and back alleys, there were women who resisted. Quietly, cleverly, and sometimes ferociously. Some resistance took the form of escape. There are accounts, buried in parish records and local gossip, of wives who vanished before the auctioneer's bell could toll. They fled by night, slipping through fields, traveling on foot with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Some joined distant relatives. Others hid among sympathetic households who risked punishment to shield them. For these women, flight was dangerous, but it was better than being treated like livestock before a jeering crowd. Others resisted more openly, though their defiance was costly. There were cases where wives stood before the crowd and shouted their refusal. They would not go, they declared, no matter what sum of money was offered. Such moments shocked audiences, turning what was supposed to be a spectacle of humiliation into one of raw defiance. Yet more often than not, these women were dragged away, their voices drowned out by laughter, their resistance crushed by force. Yet even in silence, resistance flickered. A woman might strike bargains in secret, ensuring that the man who bought her was at least kinder than the one she left behind. Some even used the auction to their advantage, steering it towards someone they trusted, a friend, a distant cousin, or even a man who had shown them respect. In these rare cases, the auction became not an ending, but a passage toward a life less brutal. There were also women who turned resistance into memory. They passed down stories to daughters and granddaughters, warning them of what could happen, urging them to be strong, to demand more from the men who sought to control them. These stories traveled through generations, ions, small flames of rebellion kept alive in kitchens and sewing rooms. And then there were the collective acts of resistance. In some towns, women banded together to protect one another. If word spread that a husband intended to sell his wife, neighbors might intervene. They might hide her, distract him, or create such disorder that the auction could not take place. These moments were rare, but they proved that solidarity was possible. That even in an age of silence, there were voices that refused to be stilled. The authorities, of course, tried to stamp out such defiance. Women who fled could be hunted down, branded as criminals, or forced back into marriages they despised. Those who spoke out risked being ostracized, shunned not only by men, but sometimes by other women who feared punishment by association. Yet for all the machinery's strength, resistance persisted. It was not loud, not revolutionary, but it was there, in every woman who slipped away, in every wife who refused to bow her head, in every whispered warning carried forward in memory. And it is in those small acts of defiance that history finds its cracks. Cracks that widened over time until the machinery itself began to falter. As the 19th century advanced, the quiet machinery of wife auctions could no longer remain hidden in the shadows of taverns and market squares. Newspapers, which had once treated such events with silence or mocking detachment, began to expose them with growing intensity. Reporters, eager to feed a public appetite for scandal, penned lurid descriptions of auctions. They described women standing pale and rigid on wooden platforms, their arms bound by shawls or ropes, while husbands barked out prices like tradesmen selling cattle. They recounted the jeers of drunken crowds, the raucous laughter of men bidding, the tears of children clutching at their mothers' skirts. These accounts shocked polite readers, who liked to imagine that England was a land of civility and progress, not one where wives were traded like animals. But the truth, once written down, could not be buried. Each printed story drew outrage from reformers, clergymen, and politicians. Pamphlets were published decrying the practice, calling it a national disgrace. Even foreign newspapers picked up the tales, mocking England for its hypocrisy, a nation that boasted of liberty, yet treated its women as possessions. This exposure shifted the machinery from something tolerated to something despised. In villages where auctions still occurred, shame began to creep into the proceedings. Some husbands tried to conduct sales in secret, whispering in alleys or arranging trades away from the public gaze. Others disguised the transactions as informal agreements, handing wives to new partners under the thin veil of mutual consent. Yet secrecy could not erase memory. Every public auction left a stain on the community. Children who had witnessed their mothers being sold carried that memory like a wound. Women who endured the humiliation rarely forgot the faces of those who laughed as they were priced and traded. Over time, these collective memories built a quiet, simmering outrage that no amount of legal indifference could smother. Still, the machinery did not collapse all at once. It sputtered, clung to life, and shifted forms. Where once wives were sold openly in markets, now transactions occurred in whispered agreements, in forged papers, in backroom deals. But each attempt to hide the act revealed its weakness. The more society recoiled, the more difficult it became to pretend the system was anything but cruelty wrapped in ritual. The exposure also planted seeds for something larger, the recognition that women were not property but people. Reformers seized upon the wife auctions as proof of how deeply society devalued women. They used the outrage to press for changes in marriage laws, inheritance rights, and property ownership. What had once been treated as a shameful local spectacle became fuel for a broader movement demanding justice. By dragging the auctions into the light, the machinery was weakened. What had been tolerated for generations was now recognized for what it truly was: a grotesque performance of power, a spectacle of cruelty. And though the practice limped on in pockets of the country, its end was now inevitable. As the tide of public opinion shifted, voices that had long been ignored began to gather strength. Reformers, many of them women who had endured lives of quiet suffering, recognized that wife auctions were not just isolated scandals, but symbols of a deeper sickness within society. If a woman could be priced like livestock, what dignity could any woman truly claim? Pamphlets and speeches began to circulate, crafted by early feminists and social critics who saw the practice as both a legal failure and a moral disgrace. They described, often in painful detail, the humiliation of wives marched through markets with halters tied around their arms or necks. They painted images of mothers separated from children, of communities jeering as families were torn apart. These stories stirred the conscience of readers who had once dismissed such events as curiosities of the lower classes. Clergymen joined the cause, thundering from pulpits that marriage was a sacred covenant, not a contract to be broken on the auction block. Their sermons condemned the men who participated and shamed the communities that tolerated such spectacles. Even conservative politicians, wary of being mocked by foreign critics, began to speak of the need for reform. But the reformers faced resistance. Many in rural towns argued that auctions were practical solutions for unhappy marriages, especially when legal divorce was too costly. They framed the sales as mutual agreements, where wives often consented in exchange for better prospects with new partners. Yet reformers challenged this illusion of consent, pointing out that desperation is not freedom, and that women forced into public degradation were hardly exercising choice. Gradually, small victories accumulated. Local magistrates began refusing to recognize auctions as legitimate transfers of marriage. In some towns, police were instructed to break up such gatherings before they could begin. Courts increasingly sided with women who sought protection from abusive husbands, citing the shame of wife sales as evidence of mistreatment. Education played its role too. As literacy spread, ordinary people encountered arguments about equality, morality, and justice that had once been confined to intellectual circles. Newspapers and journals gave reformers a megaphone, amplifying their outrage and ensuring that stories of wife auctions reached beyond village gossip into national debate. Most importantly, women themselves began to push forward. Those who had been sold or who had witnessed the sale of others spoke out, writing letters, giving testimonies, and supporting campaigns for legal reform. Their courage transformed the abstract idea of justice into living testimony. Each voice added weight to the demand for change. By the mid-19th century, the momentum was undeniable. What had once been seen as a grim tradition of the poor was now recognized as a barbaric relic, a stain on England's conscience. The reformers had not yet dismantled the structures of inequality, but they had exposed one of its ugliest faces. The rise of reformers did not just signal the decline of wife auctions. It marked the beginning of a broader struggle, a movement that would soon press for rights that went far beyond the marketplace. For centuries, the law had looked the other way. Wife auctions survived not because they were written into statutes, but because they existed in the gray space between legality and custom. Courts preferred not to interfere, communities enforced their own rules, and women were left with little recourse. But by the 19th century, as reformers grew louder, the legal system could no longer remain silent. Judges began to confront cases where auctions had left deep scars. A man who attempted to claim a woman he had purchased discovered that courts increasingly rejected his argument. Judges reminded him that wives were not property, that a public sale had no standing in law, and that marriage could only be ended through legitimate proceedings. These decisions spread, each one narrowing the cracks in which wife auctions had flourished. Parliament, too, began to stir. Debates over marriage reform acknowledged the practice, sometimes with embarrassment, sometimes with outrage. Lawmakers recognized that as long as divorce remained inaccessible, desperate men and women would seek alternatives. So gradual changes were introduced. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, though imperfect, allowed divorce to be handled in civil courts rather than by costly church proceedings. Suddenly, ending a marriage, while still difficult, no longer required the wealth of the elite. This was a turning point. The legal acknowledgement that ordinary people deserved access to divorce stripped away one of the main justifications for auctions. Why turn to the marketplace if there was now a lawful alternative? As divorce became more attainable, the auction block lost its grim appeal. Still, the law did not move quickly enough for many. Some wives continued to be paraded before crowds well into the late 19th century, their sales carried out in defiance of both morality and modern legislation. Yet these sales were now scandals, not traditions. Newspapers reported them with disgust, framing them as crimes rather than curiosities. What had once been a tolerated custom was now something to be prosecuted. Lawyers and judges also began to reshape public understanding of marriage. No longer merely a private arrangement or a transaction between families, marriage was being reframed as a contract under the protection of the state, with rights and responsibilities that could not be casually transferred. This shift chipped away at the very logic of auctions, which had thrived on the notion that women were commodities to be exchanged. By the dawn of the 20th century, the legal tide was irreversible. Even if a village attempted to stage an auction, the law now had the tools to punish those involved. What had once been defended as tradition was now prosecutable as abuse. The law, at long last, had awakened. But the scars left by centuries of silence could not be erased so easily. For many women, the memory of humiliation lingered, and for reformers, the fight had only begun. The struggle for women's rights would continue, and the story of wife auctions would become one of its most haunting reminders of how long injustice can hide in plain sight. As the 19th century moved forward, public attitudes began to shift. Newspapers that once reported the sales with lurid fascination now started to criticize them as barbaric relics of a bygone age. Intellectuals and moral reformers argued that Britain, which prided itself on civilization and empire, could not continue to tolerate such a practice within its own towns and villages. Campaigns began to appear in print, highlighting the cruelty of treating human beings like livestock. The more urbanized and industrialized society became, the less patience it had for the spectacle of a woman being sold in a market square. The Victorian obsession with morality and family values added further pressure. Respectability was now currency, and public wife sales became a mark of national shame. Gradually, the tide turned against the custom, though in small pockets of rural England, whispers of sales continued in secret. By the mid to late 19th century, wife auctions had nearly vanished, but a few final cases still shocked observers. The last documented instances drew crowds not because they were accepted traditions, but because they were seen as bizarre curiosities. These final sales often sparked outrage in newspapers, igniting debates about class, poverty, and gender. Some buyers were motivated less by genuine desire and more by notoriety, seeking their names in the headlines. Legal authorities, previously content to turn a blind eye, now began intervening more frequently. In several cases, police arrested participants, declaring the sales invalid and humiliating to all involved. This clash between outdated custom and modern law marked the death knell of the practice. The wife auction, once tolerated as a desperate solution, now existed only as a scandalous anecdote of England's past. At the same time that auctions declined, industrial society was reshaping the lives of both men and women. Factories, cities, and wage labor disrupted the rural traditions that had once supported such markets. Women were slowly gaining access to new opportunities, both in work and in education. The women's rights movement, though still fragile, began to challenge the idea that women were property to be disposed of. Writers, activists, and reformers argued that marriage should be based on partnership rather than ownership. Men, too, were forced to reckon with these changes. The idea that a husband could simply sell his wife no longer aligned with the image of modern masculinity that Victorian society was constructing. What had once been tolerated as a rough-and-ready custom of the poor was now denounced as a barbarism incompatible with progress. Although wife auctions faded into history, they left behind a powerful cultural imprint. Writers of the time, from novelists to satirists, often referenced the practice as a symbol of rural backwardness or human cruelty. Ballads, jokes, and anecdotes passed down through generations ensured that the memory of auctions lingered long after the last hammer fell. For Victorian novelists, the theme of women treated as commodities fit neatly into broader critiques of class and marriage. Even in the 20th century, historians rediscovered the practice as an example of the contradictions in English society, a nation that outlawed the slave trade abroad while tolerating its own peculiar form of domestic bondage. The echoes of the bride auctions reveal how cultural memory preserves uncomfortable truths, reminding us of practices we would prefer to forget. The story of Victorian wife auctions cannot be seen in isolation. Around the world, countless cultures practiced forms of human trade disguised as tradition or necessity. In some societies, women were bartered for dowries or bride prices. In others, arranged marriages placed daughters in households against their will. The English auction was unusual in its public spectacle, but not in its underlying logic. Women everywhere were often treated as property, and their lives shaped by economic pressures beyond their control. Comparing these systems reveals a universal theme: societies struggling to reconcile human dignity with custom, poverty, and survival. By examining these parallels, we see that the bride auctions were not merely a quirk of English history, but part of a much larger story of how gender and power intersect across time and place. The tale of the Victorian bride auctions is both chilling and revealing. On the surface, it is a story of desperation, poor families trapped in circumstances so dire that they resorted to selling a wife or mother in the market square. Yet on a deeper level, it is also a story about resilience, change, and the power of social evolution. What was once tolerated as common practice eventually became condemned as unthinkable. The decline of wife auctions reflects society's ability to redefine values, to recognize injustice, and to move toward greater dignity for all. But it also warns us of how easily exploitation can be normalized under the guise of tradition. In remembering these sales, we are forced to confront uncomfortable questions. How many of today's customs will future generations view with the same horror? And how do we ensure that dignity and freedom remain at the center of human relationships? The legacy of the bride auctions, then, is not just history. It is a mirror reflecting both the progress we have made and the vigilance still required.